One of the things that we talk about a lot at these conferences at Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat is how to make sure that the skylines of the world aren't homogeneous, that they don't all look the same, that they respond to local context, and sometimes that's vernacular architecture, sometimes it's something completely different. But I wonder what your thoughts are on how to keep the cities of the world and of China, give them some identity.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and it comes up because there's a lack of identity currently. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've come to the conclusion that the lack of identity happens despite all the efforts of individual buildings to become landmarks with identity, sponsoring identity. But as they accumulate and agglomerate, paradoxically, they cancel each other out and generate something which becomes indistinct. And that is despite the fact that perhaps there was an attempt to incorporate cultural relevance into the particular iconographies, but as they agglomerate and accumulate, they generate this paradoxical homogenization. And that's something which can't be prescribed. I think the alternative to this is not for planners to come in heavy-handedly and restrict degrees of freedom, because the degrees of freedom of architects are required to tease out the particular requirements of place and purpose coming through developers. So the degrees of freedom in design must be there. And I think they can be even further expanded with what I call parametricism. We have even more degrees of freedom in creating forms, so the forms become even richer, diversified. But what parametricism offers on top is something which I think should give us hope with respect to developing new identities, not tying in necessarily with historical cliches of cultural references, but generating bottom-up and new identities with respect to the particular locations when the buildings respond to local climates, but also when they develop path-dependent, unpredictable new identities, if the architects and designers would link up and also use the new, not only variability potential of parametricism and the new computational techniques, but the new affiliative, responsive, resonating capacities of the new techniques and technologies.
So how will that parametricism go mainstream, essentially? It sounds
well,
like
it's actually is the requirement for it to impact positively significantly would be to go mainstream. How does it go mainstream? It is the same way modernism went mainstream, where the protagonists lead the way, publish and inspire the next generation of architects. If you look back in the early 1920s, when Gropius founded the Bauhaus and collected a series of key modernist designers and forged that school, that what they conceived there in terms of urbanism, architecture, industrial design, really transformed the physiognomy of the whole planet in the decades past. When they came out in the 20s, their products looked like alien invaders, like strange otherworldly creatures which seemed kind of weird and absurd nearly to people accustomed to traditional architecture. But if you then move forward, and this is the same protagonist, Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, still lived through the 60s, seeing their vision transforming whole cities, whole landscapes. And in those periods, you actually had modernist beauty, modernist elegance. If you look at a creation like Brasilia, or the Art Deco strictive in Miami, or the New York of that era, or places like Chicago, built in the 60s under the guidance of Mies, these were actually beautiful, coherent visions. And it's only in the decades since where we found that strange condition of requiring more degrees of freedom even than modernism had. And we had the end of central planning, because we're living in a different era. The modernist era was the era of government-led development, of a quasi-socialist and real socialist in both West and East, and that tied in with modernism, with the strategy of clean, grid-like layout, separation, and clean master planning.
Yeah.
We don't have that. We need very, very different concepts. So we have an interim period of confused experimentation and letting the market loose, which a lot of people criticize, and they want the planners to come in and clamp down and regulate. I think that's fallacious. That's impossible. What we need to do, we need to embrace the market. We need to embrace the new degrees of freedom, the entrepreneurship, but then develop a disciplinary response which allows bottom-up, in my view, path-dependent forging of new identities, which I always compare to the way ecologies and natural environments evolve. There are many different forces at play. There's rivers, mountains, the various species of plant, the fauna as well, with all their species, and they all interconnect, interjoin, and create something in the end quite lawful and coherent without the master planner. I don't believe that there's intelligent design. It's a bottom-up evolutionary process which can generate incredible richness, the endless forms of nature, always unpredictable, always new, but always coherent, adaptive, lawful, so that we can actually navigate this natural environment, because we can infer one species from another. The river can be inferred from the mountainscape. The different sun orientations reflect themselves in the vegetation, and the way in parametrism they would reflect themselves on the different facade articulations, perforations, shading. The different buildings would resonate and respond to each other. That's my vision. It's a dream at the moment, because we are in a minority in an era of, let's say, style wars. I want the style wars to be moving into an era of stylistic convergence, and we were in that era, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I think there was a backlash against that recently with respect to financial crisis, European debt crisis, Arab Spring, where some of this optimism and investment in new technologies was kind of came to a halt if there's not much work, and there's a sense of pulling back, of having gone too far. That has hampered a little bit the trajectory of parametrism. So that's why I've stepped back and announced actually a new stage of parametrism, parametrism 2.0, which is no longer technology focused, but really is trying to make the argument about the social functionality, the sociological underpinnings of this epochal style.
Yeah, and what are those underpinnings? Because I wonder, just like modernism had its vocabulary of materials and lines and ideas, it also had these guiding principles of what the purpose of architecture was, how a city should be. So beyond the new vocabulary of shapes that parametricism allows, what are the guiding principles?
Well, that's very important. That's the question. And if that isn't understood, then we will always be rejected, dismissed as weird
or fanciful,
and strange and fanciful and superficial, and even within the movement itself, that isn't always clear. So, because there's an intuitive enthusiasm about playing with these forms, a lot of architects, young architects, come in and love to work, but they can't argue. They don't know, and they're defenseless when they face the sharp criticism of those who think this is fanciful and meaningless.
But it's an exploration.
But I think there is a deep meaning in this project, which is sociologically based, it's socioeconomically based. First of all, it speaks towards the convergence into dense agglomerative conditions, whereas modernism was spreading out, the suburbanization, laying out the order of the city. It's now we're in a different era. Microelectronic revolution has to be looked at as the main driver, opening up that customization potential, that radical fast-track innovation. Now we have automated and robotic factories which can be reprogrammed weekly, daily, where the information cycles come together. So we actually coming together in that super brain of the city, which is now really the R&D, marketing, financing, globalizing, thinking hubs everywhere. And we need to come together. We need to be 24/7 connected, that I call it the post-Fordist network society. And for that, we are knowledge workers. That has been referred to as the knowledge economy. And for that, we need to come very, very close together, and we need to in fluid, ever-changing, overlapping conditions of collaborativeness, rather than being separated out, knowing what we're doing, beavering away and on a green field with the different departments neatly ordered and separated. We're now kind of fusing in networks of corporations, and also our lives are no longer work, entertainment, education. This all is a continuous learning and stimulation process where we need to be together 24/7. And that's what parametrism speaks towards. It speaks towards the high intensity communicative textures where things interpenetrate, where there's enormous amount of variety instead of sameness. We're not producing one product, we don't have one family, we don't have one kind of career, we have a whole diversity and richness of careers and in-between conditions. And this is the kind of things which the contemporary city delivers, and I think parametrism speaks towards. So, and it also is the one design methodology which can also incorporate all the computational empowerment which we need to, which first of all delivers a new society in its other aspects, production aspects, finance aspect, medical aspects, that kind of customization. We also can bring that into architecture. We can customize our solution. We can optimize engineering solutions. It's not one generic steel beam repeated endlessly. This was the economies of mass mechanical reproduction. Now we have economies of scope, economies of intricate adaptation, where we can make each element separate and mutually adaptive. And that's what we incorporate in parametricism. But I'm emphasizing now the deep sociology of a network society, which is very different from this kind of mechanical society where we have a stable division of labor. Now we have a fluid, integrative texture of urban communication. And that's what our buildings try to do. So we do these hollowed out towers which network all the rooms to each other, intervisibility, 360-degree interface of communication. Our buildings are all about three-dimensional, offering the various institutions, the various events. They all look at each other continuously in a porous, sponge-like three-dimensional texture, rather than being separated out neatly so that they don't disturb each other. We must be continuous in our faces, and that's what this style delivers. That's the message.
What then do you think is the role of planners or of governments or of these larger systems that sit on top of the design of a single project?
That's really a tough situation, and I think we've been looking at the last 20, 30 years an erosion of the planner's power, authority, because in the old days planning meant also physical planning, laying out the infrastructures. You had actually planning bureaus and architectural bureaus in the government offices. They were actually not only planning, blueprinting, but also designing, executing, investing, financing all the schools, the universities, the train stations, the infrastructures, the housing. So this was really central state planning. Now, we're in a very different era now. We believe that this is the new intricacy of networking together. We need the individual nodes of the network need to be free to find each other, to synergize with others. So we believe in the market process when it comes to the economy, globalization, entrepreneurship. And I think the built environment has to catch up with this. There's far too much still attempts to plan, to restrict, to regulate. And that's hampering the process, that delivers delays, that delivers irrationality, so that there's an allocation. This zone is for residential, this zone is for business, this zone is for retail. I think this should be overthrown. So I believe that the planners need to kind of pull back, and we can try how the rationality of planning becomes private planning, becomes guided initiative. It needs to, the signaling of profit and loss shows also what works, which expands. If you lose money with your intuition, you pull back quickly, whereas a planner can keep going with the wrong idea because there's no feedback, no signal. We have to become more flexible. We can't believe as residents that when we purchase a particular apartment or building, that we have purchased a kind of freezing of the neighborhood for the next 40 years.
Right.
That's a false presumption, but it is somehow underlying. The politics suggests this, that you can have kind of neighborhood groups and prevent change in your neighborhood. But if everybody in the neighborhood tries to prevent change, then we really don't change and evolve, and this is really hurting everybody in the end, also in these cities, because these cities don't become as vibrant and as forward-looking as they should be. And I feel that in London is the case. London, there's a lot of building going on, a lot of densification, but it could be 3 times as much. So that's where I feel that I'm hoping and proselytizing for planners to become, I wouldn't say get out of the way altogether in one big revolution, but see how they can pull back and give more scope and responsibility to both entrepreneurs, developers, and indirectly, therefore, customers to define the character of their neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.